If someone like me chooses a private school, that's not only unremarkable, it's uncontroversial. Nobody questions my ability to do this. Now along comes an Eva Moskowitz and figures out a way to give low-income people of color something similar, and now it's a problem.
Robert Pondiscio, thanks for coming in. Welcome to AEI.
Thanks, Nat.
So Robert, you're a senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Foundation, and you've been an inner city school teacher.
Still am, at least part-time.
Still in, part-time. But we brought you here to talk about your new book, How the Other Half Learns, Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice. I've read the book. I'm probably going to read it again because I read it under time constraints, and I want to go through it a little more slowly. But it says right here, it's about your year inside America's most controversial charter school, which is Success Academy in New York. So just to start off, what's made Success Academy one of the most notable and notorious charter school networks?
Oh, goodness, how much time do we have? Well, for starters, Success is led by a very controversial lightning rod figure, its founder and CEO, Eva Moskowitz, who's a former New York City council person, long rumored to be interested in running for mayor someday. The thing that makes them both an object of envy and scorn, I think, is their results. There are, and this is just from memory, so I hope I've got this more or less right. Last year, I think there were about 38 Success Academy schools with kids in testing grades. The poorest performing one had something like 92% of the kids at or above grade level in math, and a similar number, about 85% at or above grade level in reading. Those were the worst ones. In other words, all the other ones were better. And so literally nobody, as far as I know, in this country has grown a charter network to that size, 17,000 kids, 50 schools roughly, without an identifiable weak sister, as it were. So in terms of their quality and consistency, that's literally unprecedented. So people have been curious, as have I, for a very long time. Okay, how exactly do they do this? Because nobody else seems to have cracked this code.
Sure, and to put this in perspective, the Holy Grail is closing the achievement gap. Right. We want to close the achievement gap.
They haven't closed it. They've reversed it.
They've reversed it.
Right. If Success Academy were a standalone school district, and with 17,000 kids, it's larger than many school districts in New York State, it would be by far the highest performing one in the state of New York, including places like Scarsdale and Jericho, Long Island, that are with multi-million-dollar homes and whatnot.
Names we know.
Yeah.
So the book gets into these things, and it's really well done. It evokes a year that you spent and your experiences observing with not unfettered, but pretty open
close.
access.
Yeah.
You spent most of your time in Bronx 1. I usually don't do this, but you've got a great prologue here, and it really sort of sets the tone. So I'm actually going to ask you to read it.
Sure.
Yeah, just
happy to.
Take a go at it. It doesn't take too long.
No, and it really kind of gives you a sense of the flavor, so thanks for asking. It's as follows. The leadership team at Success Academy Bronx 1 Elementary School is making its morning round of classroom visits. Principal Elizabeth Vanlick started the day by announcing deliverables for every teacher, which she and her assistant principals expect to see when they enter a classroom. Students should be on task at least 95% of the time. Teachers are expected to notice off-task behavior 100% of the time, and without prompting, take corrective action to refocus and re-engage inattentive students every time. After each classroom visit, Vanlick and her team strategize in the hallway, rehearsing the feedback each teacher should get. One of the assistant principals goes back inside and whispers into the teacher's ear. Changes are made immediately, in real time, and without interrupting classroom instruction. After the walkthrough, the school leadership team huddles to discuss both teachers and students who need their immediate attention. The meeting concludes with a discussion of whole school improvements that need to be made for tomorrow. Two assistant principals take out their cell phones and start calling parents to ask for brief chats in person at that afternoon's dismissal to address concerns that have come up with their children. It's August 15th. The school year is 3 hours old. So that was literally the first day.
3 hours old.
Yeah, and that level of intensity.
That's a marked difference from what we expect to see in a typical house.
Yeah.
In a typical school. When you started out this project, you got permission to come into the school for the year. What did you expect to do?
Well, I expected, I think I wrote this in the book, to tell a story about curriculum and instruction, or at least I expected that's what the story would be. And part of that is confirmation bias, frankly. I mean, that's what I tend to write about and focus on in my work is practice, what kids do all day.
In the classroom.
In the classroom, that's exactly right. Which I think we've just basically missed. Those of us who are in the reform space, we tend to focus on the structures, testing, teacher quality, data, chartering, etc. I'm the weird guy who says, can we talk about what the kids are doing all day? Right. So I wanted to tell a story about what the kids were doing all day, but that ends up being largely a story about school culture as much as more than curriculum and instruction.
Yeah, and so let me put a pause on that, because I definitely want to get to the school culture part. It's fascinating, but at the same time, it's worth outlining what the curriculum instruction approach that happens in success schools is, and also to note that it happens pretty uniformly across success schools. So just lay it out for us briefly.
Yeah, sure. I mean, on the one hand, why do you do a book like this? Because why do we have charter schools? We're hoping they're going to be laboratories of innovation, as it were, that are going to teach us lessons that we can apply more broadly. Sure. I don't believe, and we can talk more about this later if you like, that there are all that many lessons. Eva Moskowitz would probably disagree. I know she disagrees. But one of the lessons I think that is transferable is the curriculum. Now, let me start this by saying, look, I'm a curriculum guy. I really do believe there's good, better, and best. I have very strong feelings about curriculum. I don't necessarily love some of the curricular choices that success makes. But the key thing, a bit of an epiphany for me, is that they have a curriculum. And it, even though it may not be what I would choose if I were starting a school, the fact of the matter is having a well-defined curriculum changes the teacher's job in ways that I think contribute to success, as it were.
Well, hold on a second,
sure.
Robert, because every school's got a curriculum.
You think so? Let me assure
you
that
to think so.
You would like to think so. Most of us would. Most of us are wrong. Yeah, at least at the elementary and middle school level, and brief diversion, there was a RAND study some years ago that showed what a lot of us knew, but they actually put numbers to it. Something like 98%, almost literally every teacher in America, is relying on materials, some or in whole or in part, materials they find themselves, create themselves or find themselves. So the de facto curriculum in this country tends to be Google and Pinterest and teachers pay teachers and whatnot. So yes, you are under the impression that many of us are, but frankly, Nat, it's an incorrect impression.
And at Success, they have a well-defined curriculum, and if I'm in one classroom in Bronx 1, I'm going to see another classroom
almost
across
certainly.
town.
You walk across the hall and you can probably hear the teacher finishing the sentence you heard in the other one. But that gives a misimpression. I don't want to give the impression that there's a scripted curriculum. It's not scripted. It is prescriptive, so to speak. So there's no mystery about what gets taught. But what this does is it changes the job of a teacher. Instead of spending all that time on Google and Pinterest, you're practicing teaching that lesson. You're studying student work. You're building relationships with kids and families, all of which is more valuable than sitting there night after night with the empty plan book by your elbow thinking, what am I going to teach tomorrow? So that change of the culture of teaching from being a lesson designer and deliver to a pure pedagogue, if you like, I think that's how they get young, ambitious people to competence and beyond as teachers very quickly.
Right. Now, Success has sort of this reputation as they're a drill and kill school, on the basics. It makes you think non-progressive education, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
That's not necessarily the case.
Well, it's interesting because Eva Moskowitz likes to describe her schools as, I think this is her quote, Catholic school on the outside, Bank Street on the inside. Everybody knows what Catholic school is. Bank Street is this kind of progressive, Dewey-esque school, college of education on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I actually think it's a little bit less progressive than Eva Moskowitz suggests. Right. There's not a lot there that would meet my test for progressive education. Their approach to math is fairly constructivist. It's not drill and kill, that said, but it's again a prescriptive curriculum. They do a lot of things that do make sense that others should do. They stress phonics in the early grades. They stress automaticity in math. But let's be clear that Catholic piece of the model. It's very much in evidence. Uniforms, kids walking in straight line, very high expectations, very rules-driven. You're going to show up at this time. You're going to go home at that time. They have, they are unabashed about suspending kids even as young as kindergarten if they break the rules, etc. High expectations for parents.
Well, this is where you get into the culture part.
That's right.
I went in to talk
that's
about
the Catholic
to look at curriculum instruction, and a lot of the book is about the culture.
Yeah.
And so, what stands out? How does the culture at Success Academies stand out from what we expect in other schools?
Yeah, well, it's the fact that it's quite well codified. It's interesting to me, if you'll indulge a brief digression, how much I've learned since leaving the classroom. I was, and by the way, it's worth noting, the reason I ended up in this school at Bronx One is it's literally across the street from where I was a student teacher in the New York City Department of Education, and a few blocks from where I was a fifth grade teacher in a low-performing public school for 5 years. So many things that I learned almost accidentally as a teacher that I intuited my way to, I see in evidence there. And I remember saying when I was a classroom teacher, you know what, I just want there to be one set of rules. They don't have to be my rules, but there can't be a different set of rules in my room, in Ms. Balraj's room, in Ms. Hall's room.
Sure.
The kids have to know how to conduct themselves in every place in here. We all have to be singing from the same hymnal. That was, at the time as a teacher, my frustration speaking. Well, that's what they do at Success. I mean, there is a very well understood, coherent, cohesive, common culture throughout all their schools. So it leaves no mystery for kids as to what's expected of them.
So, Robert, let me ask you a question about how this culture gets extended across all these schools, right? I mean, in a lot of districts, you will have efforts to make things the same, but there's actually a good bit of autonomy and differentiation across schools. It seems like there's a lot of uniformity across these schools and also some staffing models at Success that enable them to do that. How does that work?
Yeah, hiring is a big part of it as well. I mean, you don't find yourself teaching at Success Academy by accident. They kind of put you through the ringer on the front end and then train you. I wish, honestly, I'm not sure I could work at Success, but I sure wish I'd train there. But so they can sort a little bit for skill and will, as it were, and then create teachers out of mostly young staff who really tend not to have come with other preconceived notions in many ways. They also have, and this is another piece I think, Nat, that would be transferable to other settings. They've got a really good ops team, operations. Every school has what they call a BOM, or business operations manager.
Best title in the school, no doubt.
It's kind of cool. I'm the BOM. And these are the folks who are responsible for everything non-instructional. A light is out, a window shade is broken, there's graffiti in the courtyard. They literally do walkthroughs multiple times to create that. And I'm not sure this is something we can brag about, but it's almost the broken windows thing. It creates a culture, especially in a neighborhood where schools are often covered with trash or graffiti, that are unlovely places. These schools, because of the operations team and because of this coherent culture, are bright, cheerful, well lit, inviting. They're warm places to be in, despite the reputation that some people have with or perceive with Success. But these business or these BOMs, these operations people, that's their full-time job. Basically, is making sure that everything is working, so that and all of it too is focusing the teacher's job on teaching,
right?
And the principal's job on being an instructional leader.
Right.
Everything
so they
else
onboard a lot of the operations, and this offloads a lot of responsibilities that teachers
it focuses everybody else's job on the task at hand.
Yeah, and you brought up broken windows sort of approach. I thought of the same thing as I'm reading the book, and it brings me back to the tough stance that Eva Moskowitz is really willing to take in this model, and leaves me to the basic question: how important is Eva Moskowitz to Success Academy?
I think huge. I'm not sure it could be overstated how important she is. In other words, it feels like, and it's interesting because she's not a major character in the book.
Right.
I feel like plenty has been written about her, but it would be incorrect to suggest anything other than her ideas, her vision, her energy drives the model too. So it's really a manifestation of who she is, I think, in many ways. So she'd be difficult to replace. That said, there are any number of principals and network staff who have just drunk deeply from her vision. So I think, is it possible that they could maintain this level of excellence without her? For a while, but it's almost inevitable in this work. Things, you put a new person in charge and they kind of want to tinker with the model.
Sure. What's it like to teach in a Success Academy?
It's really hard. There were so many times when I was in a classroom where I was in the presence of what I perceived to be really good instruction, and my very next thought would be, I'm not sure I could do this.
What do you mean?
Well, look, I guess particularly in math, I'm an unrepentant algorithm guy. I want kids to know their math facts, and I'm not going to I'm going to teach you the steps to long division rather than try to have you conceptualize it. That said, watching the way they teach math at Success Academy still causes me to kind of question my convictions around there. So it's real. I shouldn't be glib about it. I ended up feeling, maybe I sold my kids short by not thinking they're capable of learning math this way. Maybe I sold myself short as a teacher by leaning into my frustration after a few days of trying to get kids to do it the conceptual way, just closing the door and showing them the steps. Maybe I failed them and I sold them short.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a couple other episodes in the book that are they're tough to read, at least with a dry eye. Some of them.
Yeah.
They have some kindergarten teachers who put a lot on the kids. They what do they push it on the kids? Is
yeah.
That's
put the
what
lift
they say?
on the kids. Yeah.
And they make heavy demands.
Yeah.
And they are non-repentant about it. And that seems like it would be a tough thing to get acclimated to.
I think I describe somewhere in the book that the entire thing's a bit of a Rorschach test, right? There was this one moment, speaking of kindergarten, I spent one classroom I kept returning to over and over was a classroom led by a woman named Carolyn Siskowski, who just struck me as particularly gifted, and there was a good representation of what they're trying to achieve. To me, one of the big moments in this book where I kind of start to understand it myself, there was what I call a come to Jesus meeting, where she is functionally reading the riot act to parents about how they need to step up their game and be more supportive.
And to parents of kindergarten.
To parents of kindergartners. Right. And, you're talking about, reading this without a dry eye. I was in the audience when she was doing this, and I was moved by her passion and her commitment. And I actually was, I think I still have it on my cell phone. I was recording it on my cell phone, and I still have it there now. So I went home and started transcribing what she was saying. And it just felt different. In other words, in the moment, I was moved by it. And when I started looking at just the words she said, I'm like, oh my Lord, the stuff that came out of that girl's mouth. Yeah. It just seemed harsh and demanding and a little cold. And that's when this occurred to me that this is very much a Rorschach test. If you listen to the words, or if you're in context, it can feel one way. It might feel a different way on the page, and that probably surfaces how you feel about charter schools and no excuses schools and the demands we make on parents. It's going to say more about the reader, I think, than the model.
Well, it's interesting you say that. I read a couple of reviews, sort of, looking for different perspectives on the book, and there are some folks who are, maybe instinctive critics of success who have drawn some lines out of the book, and man, do they look rough. I mean, they are some pretty tough words.
Yeah.
But it's much more compassionately communicated in the book, which is full of a lot of detail, a lot of dialogue, activity in the classroom, out of the classroom with parents, teachers, and students, and again, I think it's an excellently written book and really worth a read and an easy read, if occasionally tear-jerking. Let's talk a little bit more about teachers, because success does burn through staff.
Yeah, they really do. I mean, I don't have data on this, but doing some reporting and anecdotally, it seems like 40% turnover in school is not uncommon, and some even higher than that. This is one of those things that I think work against it being a scalable model. It's probably a lot easier to get a steady crop of bright, eager young men and women willing to come for a year or two in a place like New York City than, say, Youngstown, Ohio, or Utica, for example. Yeah. Privately, I don't think this made it into the book, because I think this was what I've learned since. They seem to be slightly less concerned about that than they have been. In other words, it's making their life difficult, obviously, to have to replace all these teachers every year. But so far, it's not hurting them.
Well, that's a little bit of a stunner, quite frankly.
It really
right?
is.
And, if you were faced with replacing 40% of your staff every year and maintaining the same instructional program, I would be amazed if you could pull it off. And you'd have to pull it off with a pretty centralized program.
Well, I think that's right. I think that's right. So part of it is this kind of hiring that they do. Part of it is the model and the culture that it seems pretty easy to determine whether or not the person you're bringing in is down with the program, as it were, or not. But again, it's not necessarily scalable. And I don't want to diminish. It's another Rorschach test. On the one hand, it says something interesting that you can get fairly inexperienced young men and women to this level of competence fairly quickly with a well-codified program.
Right.
That flies in the face of a lot of notions that we have about teacher quality and experience and the value of that. On the other hand, it's not sustainable either. This is not a place by and large where you're going to make a career out of. If you want to be married, have children, go home and take your kids to soccer in the afternoon, you're probably not going to be a Success Academy teacher.
Yeah, it really makes the reader and folks who are focused on education policy question the value of the unit of analysis when it comes to teacher quality, because what we've got here is something where it cannot be the quality of the teachers coming in. They're all very young, vast majorities of them. You talked about one veteran teacher, 27 years old, veteran teacher, right? A rare, and that's astonishing. And if it's not the individual unit of analysis, then the system is working powerfully to standardize these things. And that struck me through the
I think that's right. But I also think back to the idea of codifying the teacher's job in a way that is scalable. This I think is a powerful lesson. Yeah. Look, I'm not a teacher basher, okay? But I do think that we have made the job far too hard for myriad reasons we can talk about. So this is a model that, even if it is intense, there are lessons here that we can learn. Yep. And the fact that you can get this level of results. I mean, another fascinating piece of this, I'm old enough to remember some of the original KIPP schools, for example, where then as now, you would walk down the hall and you would see schools named after where the teacher went to school.
Right.
And
promoting a college expectation.
Well, that's exactly right, to create the college-going culture. So, back in the day when we were all talking about increasing the quality of teachers, you would see those, KIPP and Achievement First classrooms named like Harvard and Yale and Stanford and whatnot. There are some of those at Success Academy, but by and large, they are they're much more mundane, so to speak. There's Hunter College or SUNY Oneonta, where I went to school, Fordham, Iona. There was a kindergarten class at Bronx One called BMCC, which is Borough of Manhattan Community College. Huh. So, however they're getting these results, it is not that 20-year-old paradigm of getting bright, shiny Ivy Leaguers to come in. And they're still committing a short amount of time, but they're not necessarily coming out of those elite schools.
Well, Robert, I got a lot to talk about. I need to ask you about the whole other side of this coin, about parents, the expectations for kids. There's a number of other things. I've got so much that I think we're going to break this into two pieces. So let's take a break and we'll come back in a minute and pick it up where we left off. Hey everyone, thanks for watching part 1 of our discussion with Robert Pondiscio. If you enjoyed what you saw, remember to like the video and leave us a comment. And if you want to see more, check out part 2.